disease is a neurodegenerative disease. In other words, it affects the nervous system, and there's a degeneration that is perceived by the patient and seen by those who care for the patient.
Huntington's disease is a progressive disease, and it's a family disease, so that if there's one of a couple who has the affected gene, each child of that couple has a 50% chance of inheriting the disorder. And it's a very, very cruel disease because it has three components: a mental component, a physical component, and a personality component.
The movement disorder is not necessarily the first, although we used to think that that's what we would look for, is the movement disorder, and that would tell us that the patient is developing Huntington's disease, and that's where the loss of grip and you drop things. But in fact, that's not generally the first sign. The first sign is loss of memory, as far as I'm concerned. And there's mood swings. And mood swings where we get aggression sometimes, or we get just forgetfulness. But it is a change in the person's mood and memory. From there, that, not rapidly, but there is a gradual decline till eventually there is total loss of mental capacity, and that's where we talk about dementia. So it's usually memory first, movement second, and then dementia third. So Huntington's disease is an inherited condition. It's inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion. That means there is parent-to-child transmission of the condition in successive generations. Males and females are equally affected, and the mode of inheritance being autosomal dominance means that there is a 50% chance of the condition being passed on to the next generation.
Transmitted through the genes, so it's not contagious at all. And as I said before, if a couple have a child and one of them carries the affected gene, that is when each child is at 50% risk. But if anybody's unsure, if they're in a family with Huntington disease, if they want to know whether they are going to get it, they can have a predictive test from 18 years of age. Well, the predictive test doesn't take a long time, or the test itself, which is exactly the same as the one of the diagnostic test. It's the fact that if you're going to have a predictive test, you have to be very sure that you can cope with the result, be it positive or negative. You must be able to cope with it. So you need, I think they do 4 or 5 sessions of counselling before the test is taken, and then 1 or 2 afterwards, depending how the individual and their family find it. They're spaced well apart, at least a month apart, sometimes 6 weeks apart in the beginning, and the counsellor goes over how the transmission of Huntington's disease, the symptoms, the prognosis, all those aspects are covered. But what they do go into detail is how do you cope if you receive a gene positive result.
So it's a relatively easy test. The problem is, when do you test someone, and who should get permission to have the test done? In genetics, we believe that testing is something that one voluntary does. It's your decision, and it must be about you, for you, and it mustn't be made by anybody else but you. That's in general terms, and especially with something like Huntington's disease, which is a late onset genetic condition. Generally, we test people in their early 20s or 30s, depending on when and if they want to be tested. So the clinical manifestations, the movement disorder of Huntington's disease is an uncontrollable movement of the upper trunk of the body, the limbs, and as I said, a grimacing of the face. Uncontrollable, the patient is not aware of what they're doing and they can't control it. They also stagger around. They can't, their feet do not, they can't walk in a straight line. And so if you see someone walking down the street and they are staggering around and the upper body is moving and their face is moving, it looks like that they are inebriated. But the difference is it is not alcohol, it hasn't been stimulated by alcohol. And yes, there is stigma attached to it because there's this decline, the patient eventually becomes demented, and it affects the whole family.
And the apathy, the depression are all part of the disease. The apathy of not wanting to do anything, just happy to sit there. That's part of the disease. It's exactly the same as their speech. They have difficulty in initiating the speech. If you speak to them, they can respond, but they can't hold a conversation. It's exactly the same as the apathy. They can't initiate something. So they're quite pleased or quite happy to just sit and listen to conversation, or just sit and watch TV, or just sit and watch the activities in the home. But that is part of the disease, and there's nothing you can do about that.
The depression is often one of the symptoms that people with Huntington's disease experience, and this may be as a result of the environment. It may be as a result of being isolated and not being able to do the things they used to do, and feeling quite disheartened about where they're at and what their future holds, especially if they're feeling like there might not be much of a future at this point. So depression is often brought about as a result of feeling uncertain and feeling completely anxious and insecure about where they're at, feeling sad about the fact that they have inherited this gene, feeling scared, worried, and all these kinds of feelings might all fall under the diagnosis of depression, in that their sleeping patterns might be interrupted during that process, their eating patterns, and a general feeling of hopelessness, sometimes excessive guilt as well, as, oh my word, I've inherited this mutation, and now my carer has to look after me, and I feel incredibly guilty about that. I feel that I'm a burden, and also, I've mentioned the hopelessness, but also really low self-esteem and very fearful about where they're at, and just that despair, that feeling of despair is can really cripple a person, because they don't know how to bring themselves out of that dark space.
If they are working, very few of our cohort in Cape Town do work. They often lose their jobs, the few that do work, because they can't keep up with the standard with which they were doing. If they're in accounting, for instance, they make a lot of mistakes with the figures that they write down and the sequencing. If they're in a more physical job, if they're using sharp instruments or tools, it becomes dangerous. So they have to stop working.
So the juvenile onset variant is a larger gene, a larger copy of the gene than we see in the adult onset. So the mutation, or the change in the gene, it's called a dynamic mutation. It's an expansion, it's a repetitive motif that occurs in the Huntington's gene, in a specific part of the gene, in a part of the gene that causes Huntington's disease. And the smaller the number of repeats, the later the onset of the condition. Equally, the more repeats there are, the earlier the onset. The earlier the onset, the more dramatic the disease, and the more rapid the progression of the disease. That is what juvenile onset Huntington's is, as opposed to the usual late onset, which, as I say, is a midlife onset.
And mostly the parents will come in at 2 and say, well, the child has been walking. Now he's starting to lose his balance, and he's not just progressing at all with his milestones. The other time, or he has tremendous behavioural problems. The other time that it becomes noticeable is when they're at school and they can't keep up with the academics and they can't pass, they just stay the same. And then they start to develop the physical symptoms of slowness of movement, and sometimes the chorea, although that's not too often. So it's really just the physical movement and the lack of being able to cope up with schoolwork or a regression in school. Yes, and that can happen any stage.
Carers that have to look after the Huntington's disease patient really experience a lot of strain. They witness the progression of the illness. They witness the person deteriorating and becoming more and more dependent and needy of them. And through that, they start to feel incredibly overburdened, where their sleep patterns, may be interrupted, their own eating patterns, their own sense of peace is really taken away from them, because they are feeling incredibly responsible for this person that they're looking after. And so another initiative that we've focused on is caring for the carers, and unfortunately this hasn't taken off quite yet. We're still in the stage of developing a program, a wellness program, where carers can access supportive mechanisms, whether it's coping tools, whether it's respite, through having volunteers coming in and looking after the patient and giving the carer a break. And we're looking at training community workers and trying to make the home-based care a lot less burdensome for the carer, and a lot more of a community approach, where other family members can step in and care for the carer, and the carer can in that way become more empowered and less exhausted.
It should be that we have a cure for Huntington's disease by now, but sadly that is not the case. And one of the reasons is because it's a neurodegenerative disease and it affects all the nerves in the body. The primary insult is in the brain, and it is something that we can't stop. We can't go in and zap that part of the brain that is affected by Huntington's disease and say, well, if we take that out or we just destroy those cells, the patient will not evolve into the condition and develop all the symptoms, because the patient will not be able to live without that part of the brain.
And there's absolutely no cure for the disease, although there's quite a bit of medication that helps many of the symptoms, like chorea, like depression, and the problems with sleeping. Those are the 3 areas that medication really can help. And those are problems that the caregivers also experience.